what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to do a little introduction and background. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the health effects of lead. I'm really going to focus in that area more on the differences between how lead affects children and adults, because that's important in understanding this issue, especially and how it affects children in school and preschool. I'm going to talk about regulation of lead in drinking water. I'm going to talk from the federal statutes that govern public drinking water systems, and if you happen to be a school who supplies its own treatment of drinking water for your school, then you also fall under these regulations. And then Dave's going to follow me, and he's going to talk about the sources of lead in drinking water, getting more down into the building level, sampling for lead, and then ways to control lead in drinking water. So, by way of background, Dave found this clipping from the Washington Post that dates back to 1893, where the engineering commissioner has determined that maybe we should find something to supply water other than lead pipes, because there might be a health concern there. But if you read the article there, at the time, the plumbing regulations mandated that people use lead pipes. So, and that was pretty common practice, and it has been for a long time. So a lot of the older systems especially have a good number of lead pipes. Now, if we come forward 107 years to the year 2000, and we look at the Washington, D.C. Water and Sewer Authority, at that time in 2000, they had approximately 23,000 individual services that had lead service lines still in their system. And in November of that year, to comply with another regulation, the disinfectant byproducts regulation, they changed the type of disinfectant they were using. So they changed from chlorine to a combined chlorine residual, or chloramines. And about a year later, when they took their second round of lead tap samples, they noticed elevated lead levels. And those levels continued to rise, and the next bullet there, in 2003, in a survey of 2,500 homes in their system, a third of them tested greater than 50 parts per billion. And as we go through here, I'm going to be talking about milligrams per liter and micrograms per liter. Just to give you an idea, the current penny weighs about 2.5 grams. So a milligram is, if you take that penny and divide it 400,000 times, that's what the size of a milligram is, and a microgram is 1,000th of a milligram. So if you take those 400,000 pieces and divide them 1,000 times, that's how small a microgram is. So just to give you, and a liter, for anybody who's not familiar with metric, is about a quart. So, you know, these concentrations we're talking about are exceedingly small. So the situation in Washington, D.C. kind of came to head in 2004. There was an article on January 31st in the Washington Post that basically trumpeted to the full world that Washington, D.C. Water exceeded the EPA lead limits. In subsequent studies that were done there, the problem was solved by feeding a phosphate inhibitor, which Dave may be talking, okay, he's going to be talking about a little bit later. So if we move forward a little bit, I think the reason why the heightened concern today, 10 years later, is Flint, Michigan. Just, I like to say, I'm going to talk about Flint, Michigan. I'm leaving out the politics and the whodunit part of it, and just giving you kind of the historical, what happened there. For 50 years, the city of Flint, Michigan had an agreement with the Detroit Water and Sewer Authority to supply potable water to the city. That agreement expired on April 24th of 2014. A year in advance of that agreement expiring, the city council decided that they were going to break with the DC Water and Sewer service, and that they were going to join a new water authority, the Karen Dongdi, I always have trouble pronouncing that, water authority, which is building a new raw water supply pipeline from Lake Huron, interestingly running parallel to the Detroit pipe that was supplying the water currently. That pipeline is still under construction. It's not scheduled to be complete until the fall of this year. So when 2014 came around and the Detroit contract expired, the city did have the option to renew or extend that agreement, but they passed on that, and they do have their own drinking water facility, so they started using water from the Flint River to supply drinking water to the city. One of the key things from what Dave and I do that was sort of missed in that change order was Detroit had been adding a corrosion inhibitor to the water for many years. Flint, when they changed over to supply, decided, partially for economic reasons, not to feed that corrosion inhibitor, and the rest, they say, is history. I always like to use this article because it's probably one of the most provocative headlines that's out there, but basically what happened was, in a nutshell, the corrosion inhibitor, you feed it initially, it builds up a protective scale on the inside of pipes, especially lead pipes. And then you feed a maintenance dose to maintain that. When they stop feeding that chemical, a very expensive chemical, by the way, that coating broke down, and then it started releasing the products. The protective layer was built up, and then leaching new lead. And before I go on, and this is just a note to everybody, the Washington, D.C. and the Flint have two things in common. One is, in both cases, the water supplier either changed the source of supply or they made a significant change to treatment. So as you're looking in your community to your water supplier, if they're planning to make a change in treatment or the source, that should raise a flag to make sure that they've done their due diligence to look at the corrosion control aspect of that change. So, moving on into the health effects of lead, I've just kind of listed here the pathways for exposure and intake of lead in the body. The first way, you can get it through your skin, so you have lead particulates on your skin, but the amount that you absorb is very tiny, so that's not a very big pathway. Inhalation is very important, especially in industrial environments and environments where someone is working to sand or remove all lead paint, and those vapors, particles get in the air, get taken into the lungs and incorporated in the body. Prior to 1889, one of the biggest sources of lead in the United States was leaded gasoline and the exhaust fumes for that, which contributed considerable amount to environmental lead. Ingestion is very common in kids because they don't regularly wash their hands. If they pick up dust, dirt in an area that has been exposed to lead, they get that on their hands, they put their hands in their mouth. That is a good pathway. Many kids where there's peeling paint, I think we've all heard about those stories, will ingest the paint chips. I just put up here, in 1978, lead was banned from use in paint, so if you have a building that predates 1978, it's very likely that the paint used on that building contained lead. If it's after 1978, the likelihood is much less. Also in food, so if you're preparing food with water that has lead, that lead is going to pass into your body. Formula, one thing that they talk about is hot water will dissolve lead more than cold water. So if you're using hot water to make formula for babies, that's going to introduce a higher level of lead. That's why in the recommendations for the CDC, they recommend use cold water for making formula. And then finally, drinking water, which is really what we're going to talk about here today. Physiologically, lead, that when the body sees lead, it looks to the body a lot like calcium and zinc, which are like two primary nutrients. And the calcium part of it, if you think about where the most calcium is in your body, it's in your bones and teeth. So lead that's ingested into your body ultimately makes it into your bone, teeth, and hair. Zinc, on the other hand, combines with something's called ALAD, which is an enzyme that your body uses to basically produce the hemoglobin in your blood. So when you ingest lead, that will combine with that enzyme instead of calcium, and basically it will block that blood producing process to some extent, and that's why when we go on, you'll see that one of the symptoms of lead poisoning would be anemia. Absorption rates up here, a couple of key things I want to point out. If you notice the estimated absorption rate of children, 50% of the lead they ingest versus adults 6%. So children who are exposed to lead are much more likely to incorporate larger quantities of that lead into their body. There was also a study of adults which hadn't eaten for a day. So if you think about children, especially in parts of the population that maybe don't have the nutrition they need or don't eat regular meals, you can see from this statistic up there that then having not eaten for a day, adults in the same study basically absorbed 60 to 70% of the lead. And then finally, back to diet again, a diet that's deficient in minerals and vitamins is going to cause people to ingest more lead because it basically looks like chemically the minerals that the body is naturally looking for. And when lead's present, it will use those. When lead enters the body, the first thing that happens is it basically gets incorporated into the bloodstream. It then gets distributed to all the soft tissues, the heart, the kidneys, the lungs. And then after a period of time, I think the half-life of lead in the blood, so if you ingest some lead, the concentration will reduce to half in about 36 days. Part of that lead is going to be eliminated from your body. Part of that lead is going to be incorporated into your bones, teeth, and hair. And then elimination in adults, once again, most of that lead that's taken in your body, 99% of it, is basically passed out of your body as waste. In kids, unfortunately, only about a third of that lead passes out. So, and part of that is because their bodies are developing, they're growing, they have a higher need for those nutrients, and their body is going to absorb lead just like it would calcium or zinc at a much higher level because they're young and growing. And then if you're continued exposure to low levels of lead, that is going to show up in your tissues where it will accumulate. So those levels will get higher and higher if you're continuously exposed to lead, and they're going to build up in your bones. Recent Centers for Disease Control information on blood levels, and it basically says even low levels of blood have been shown to affect IQ, ability to pay attention, and academic achievement. And that I'm going to talk about a little bit later what kind of the level of concern is for lead, but basically there are some studies that they've done that find that there is a response down to even the lowest levels in blood. So that's why the CDC has not set any lower limit. They have set a level of concern, which I'll talk about, but there is no safe limit, and really our goal should be to expose kids to as little lead as possible, and the goal should be no lead in the blood. That's probably not possible, but that should be the goal. Acute exposure to lead. Basically, I'm not going to read through those because I got a slide right behind this that kind of shows these systems in the body. And if you notice in the middle, those are basically the nervous system reactions to lead in the body. And when I was putting this down, it kind of reminded me of a drug commercial. You know, here's all the bad things that can happen. Well, here's all the bad things that can happen in your brain, because one of the actions of lead in young children is it prevents the synapses which connect the neurons in your brain together from forming properly and connecting. And so after repeated exposure, that gets worse. There's something called an encephalopathy here, which is basically, that's just a diffuse response in the brain to very acute. We're probably talking about over 70 micrograms per deciliter in the blood of lead exposure, and basically it leads to all of these neuro responses there. Chronic lead exposure at low levels can lead to altered kidney function, which thankfully is generally reversible. It's going to lead to anemia for the reasons I told you earlier, that basically the lead blocks the formation of an enzyme that helps your body to form new red blood cells. There have been studies that show over a long period of time in older people that they'll see a rise in blood pressure because of chronic exposure to lead. And one other thing that I didn't put in here, in older people, it can also be a cause of osteoporosis, because over long periods of exposure, your body, instead of creating your bones with calcium, part of your bones are created with lead, and that reaction is reversible, so that lead, as you get older, can leave your bones and go back into your blood supply. This is just a little graphic here that kind of graphically illustrates the parts of the body and some of the responses that lead in chronic and acute exposure can cause. And you can pretty much see that it really targets all of the most important functioning parts of your body. Measurement of lead. So how do we measure lead in people? The most common measurement is just a measurement of the lead in blood, and that measurement can be done down to a very low level of concentration. Another way to do that is erythrocyte protoporphyrin, which is what is produced as a result of that enzyme that I talked to you about that gets blocked by lead. So your body's response is it produces more of the EP enzyme that can be detected in the blood. It can only be done by specialized labs, and it only goes down to 25 micrograms per deciliter, which you'll see is not a very low concentration. Long-term exposure is going to show up in your bone, hair, and teeth. If you can use X-ray fluorescence to measure the level and concentration of lead in your bones. So if you've been exposed over a long term, and you're wondering, what that has done or how much lead your body's accumulated, here's a way to measure that. In terms of lead levels, the top table here, every 4 years, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey is done. They survey kids throughout the United States and their blood levels. The top line there shows the geometric mean. The good news is you can see from this data here starting back in 1976 till now, those levels have decreased significantly, so that's a very positive thing. I think probably part of the reason for that decrease from 15 to 3.6 micrograms per deciliter is the elimination of lead in gasoline and the elimination of lead in paint during that time period. Prior to 2012, the CDC said that if you detected 10 micrograms per deciliter in a child's blood, that was their level of concern. The only reason I mention that is because if you go back a little bit of time in time to 2012 or earlier, if your child or a child was measured for blood level and it was less than 10, it generally didn't get reported to parents or anyone else. Now that level has been lowered to 5 micrograms per deciliter. The reason for that is the 97.5 percentile of national lead results from the survey. So 97.5% of all children have a lead level less than that. So now if a level greater than 5 micrograms per deciliter is detected, that's of significance to a health provider. When that level gets to greater than 20 micrograms per deciliter, the CDC guidelines say that someone should be medically evaluated and their environment should be evaluated to determine what that source of lead is and try to eliminate it. If you get up to a level of greater than 45 micrograms per deciliter, the guidance from the CDC is that someone should have treatment by chelation therapy. And I won't describe it, but that therapy sounds painful, and especially if you're a child, I don't think you'd want to go through it. For adults, so people working in areas that are exposed for lead, if you test with a blood level of 40 micrograms per deciliter, then by OSHA regulations, your workplace must be evaluated to determine the source of that lead, and if it gets to 50 micrograms per deciliter, you're supposed to be removed from that workspace. Okay, enough about health. I'm going to switch to regulating lead in drinking water. And the U.S. regulations date back to 1925. The U.S. Public Health Service established a lead limit of 0.1 milligrams per liter at that time. That was not a public drinking water, that was a public drinking water standard, but it wasn't a public drinking water system standard. So that standard only applied to water that was used in interstate commerce. And then in 1962, that standard was reduced to 0.05 milligrams per liter, and that limit was incorporated into the 1974 Safe Drinking Water Act, which was the first public water system regulation that basically regulated all suppliers of public water supplies. And that limit was set at 0.05 milligrams per liter. In 1986, the Safe Drinking Water Act was amended to ban the use of lead pipe, solder, and flux. In 1988, the Lead Contamination Control Act was passed, and I have a little bit more information on that. In 1991, the current regulation was passed, the lead and copper rule, which basically applies to all public water systems. And the lead and copper rule was and I think still is very controversial with utility suppliers for two reasons. One is prior to that date, lead was only regulated when it left the treatment plant. So you had to meet the 0.05 milligram per liter. But in the interim period, studies were finding that levels actually at the customer's tap were much higher. So the 1991 standard basically switched the method of monitoring for lead and copper in drinking water from the source of supply to the customer's tap. And that was very controversial with utilities because It imposed a pretty significant cost on them. It's very hard for some utilities to find customers who are willing to follow the pretty strict procedures for sampling for the utilities. Lead and copper rule has been revised many times, not that significantly. In 1996, what are kind of called the lead-free requirements came into effect, which basically say that plumbing fixtures have to be lead-free, and the definition of lead-free is made of less than 8% lead of the parts that come in contact with the water. With that amendment also, it established a standard to test fixtures for lead leaching, which we in the drinking water industry have to comply with, which is NSF 61. So basically, by law, any component we put in a drinking water system has to be NSF 61 tested and certified. Next was the Reduction of Lead in Drinking Water Act, which I think Dave is going to talk about, and it's good, because I'm not. Because of Flint and not because of Flint, there are on the horizon some proposals to significantly modify the lead and copper rule. Those are scheduled for promulgation in 2017. I put a question mark here because if you follow EPA regulations, especially drinking water, they're lagging about 5 to 6 years behind the dates they've set. And I think because of what's happened in Flint, those are going to be looked at again, and they may reformulate the amendments. And of course, as you know, if you've been reading the press, many different states are taking many different actions in response to the Flint situation. The Lead Contamination Control Act that was passed in 1988, purpose of it was basically, it was targeted at schools and daycare centers, and the purpose of it was trying to reduce the lead exposure of children in schools and daycare. The requirements of the rule, it required the facilities to identify water coolers that were not lead-free. It banned the manufacturer from that time forward of any water coolers that did contain any lead that was in contact with the water. It also required EPA, and you can find this, to publish a list of water coolers that did have lead in them. It authorized additional funding for lead screening, which I believe has not been carried forward since that act on the federal level. And it required repair or replacement of existing water coolers that had lead content in contact with the water. The lead and copper rule, which is the primary rule that governs water utilities right now. The reason why I want to go through this rule is because, as I said, this is the primary federal regulation that applies to every water utility, and I think it's important that you understand what is required and kind of what it means. And it's sort of a good news, bad news type of thing, because your utility could comply with this rule, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every customer is not receiving a lead level that might be of concern. So, and Priscilla didn't say this, but if there's something in here you really want to ask a question about, we'll try to field them as we go along. So lead and copper rule became effective on July 1st of 1991. All the provisions of the federal lead and copper rule have been incorporated into the New York Code in Title 10, subpart 5-1. As I mentioned earlier, the regulation was significant in that it changed the compliance point from the point of entry after the treatment plant into the distribution system to basically the customer's tap. It established an MCLG, which is a maximum contaminant level goal for lead of 0. So that's the goal we're trying to get to. It requires sampling of first draw tap samples from individual customers and businesses every 6 months. And there's some other provisions we're going to get into. Ideally, those locations that the utility picks for sampling are supposed to be locations that have a high potential for higher levels of lead and copper. Just a point of illustration, this is actual lead and copper tap sampling results for 3 years from the system that's under reduced monitoring because they are in compliance. The only thing I would point out to you is the good news and the bad news. The good news here, this up here, this is the action level, which we'll talk about in a second, where the utility has to do something. Most of the results were at the detection limit or just a little bit above. That's what you want to find. An unusual thing in this system, this particular customer in 2011 had a lead limit that was about 8 times the action level. And I don't know why that is, but I just put that up here as illustration that if you're really concerned about the level of lead at your premises, okay, and Dave is going to talk about this in his part, it doesn't just depend upon what the water utility is supplying to you, it also depends upon what is in your individual system and how you operate it. So I started this out. That's the good news and the bad news about this. The good news is a utility which is complying with all these regulations for the majority of their customers, you shouldn't have anything to worry about. But on the other hand, just because you're complying with these regulations does not also mean that you don't have an elevated level of lead. And just a point of illustration, this is actual lead and copper tap sampling results for 3 years from the system that's under reduced monitoring because they are in compliance. The only thing I would point out to you is the good news and the bad news. The good news here, this up here, this is the action level, which we'll talk about in a second, where the utility has to do something. Most of the results were at the detection limit or just a little bit above. That's what you want to find. An unusual thing in this system, this particular customer in 2011 had a lead limit that was about 8 times the action level. And I don't know why that is, but I just put that up here as illustration that if you're really concerned about the level of lead at your premises, okay, and Dave is going to talk about this in his part, it doesn't just depend upon what the water utility is supplying to you, it also depends upon what is in your individual system and how you operate it. So I started this out. That's the good news and the bad news about this. The good news is a utility which is complying with all these regulations for the majority of their customers, you shouldn't have anything to worry about. But on the other hand, just because you're complying with these regulations does not also mean that you don't have an elevated level of lead. And I want to now come to the next most important part, I think, of talking about this standard, and that's the second bullet there. So EPA under the lead and copper rule has established what's called an action level. That action level is 0.015 milligrams per liter of lead. And we're not talking about copper, but the copper limit's 1.3 milligrams per liter, just in case you have a copper problem. The most important bullet here is bullet number 2. 90% of these samples have to be less than that action level. So what does that mean? That means that 10% of the samples, or 9.9, can be greater than that action level. So once again, I go back to just because you're complying with this rule that applies to your water supplier does not necessarily mean on your premises that you might not be getting a higher level of lead. And if you happen to be a location, a home, that you collect these samples, you give it to your water suppliers, they're required by this federal law to provide you with the results of that sampling within 30 days of receiving those results. And also for half of the customers where they collect that sample, they also collect a water quality sample, and I'm not going to name the parameters here, but basically the parameters that are of significance to monitor corrosion control. Then there's something called reduced monitoring. So a system that's less than 50,000, if they've met both of the action levels, lead and copper, in 2 consecutive 6-month periods, they can go to reduced monitoring. And any system that's less than the lead action level for 2 consecutive months and meets what's called optimum corrosion control water quality parameters, they can go to reduced monitoring. And reduced monitoring starts at, instead of every 6 months, then those systems only have to measure every year. So then if you drop down below in this bullet right here, so if you're a system, you've gone to reduced annual monitoring, and if for 3 years in a row you've met the action level for 3 consecutive years, you can then go to once every 3-year monitoring. And once again, one of the flaws in this rule, I guess I would say, is there's no trigger in this rule. So if you look at the case of Flint, they changed their treatment process. They probably, I didn't investigate this, they were probably on reduced monitoring because the city of Detroit was in compliance. There's nothing that automatically reverts you back to normal monitoring if you change parameters in your source or your supply. And I think that's one of the amendments that may get put in to the rule. And then there are a couple other cases here, which I'm not going to go through, where you could go to reduce monitoring every 3 years. Okay, then that's the good news for systems. The bad news is if you exceed the action level just once, then you must implement corrosion control treatment. Once again, unfortunately, because the rule makers were trying to be cognizant of the potential financial implications of doing corrosion control treatment, if you determine you need to change your treatment process, you have 2 years to do that. So once again, once you recognize something and you determine what you need to do, you don't have to act immediately. If you exceed the action level, you must do what's called source water monitoring. So you've got to look at your source and make sure that the utility is not the one responsible for the high lead level that is somewhere out in the system. You have to start monitoring the water quality leaving the treatment plant for the corrosion control parameters every 2 weeks. And you have to immediately begin to perform public education. So basically you have to send to every customer a notification that you exceeded the action level. You have to provide with that notification information how they can reduce their level of lead. And then finally, if you're a system who has implemented optimum corrosion control You've basically done all the things that we normally do to reduce lead to its lowest levels, and you still don't meet the action level, then you have to go in, if you still have lead service lines, and start replacing them. Once again, because the regulators did not want to place a financial burden on utilities, you only are required to replace 7% per year, unless the state can step in and accelerate that to a higher level. And if you look at the bottom bullet, you can be out there replacing lead service lines, and if all of a sudden your corrosion control takes hold, you can just stop under the rules. So, and finally, and I'm going to hand it over to Dave after this, if you're on any public water supply in the United States, every public water supply every single year must publish and give to every one of their customers what's called a consumer confidence report. And basically it's a report on the last year of monitoring and how they stack up versus the regulations. I just happened to pull up here the City of Ithaca's latest consumer confidence report. In the report, they actually give you a paragraph on lead and what their lead results were. There's also in the report, there's a line that lists all the regulated parameters and how they did. One thing that's interesting about their report, if you look over there, their highest reading was at the action level. So, you know, so I just point this out to you. Like I said, you can go online, you can pull a consumer confidence report from any utility in the entire United States and EPA. If you don't find it under the utility, you can go to EPA and you can get any consumer confidence report from any utility.